The date was August 19, 1942, somewhere deep in the suffocating jungle near Taivu Point, Guadalcanal, when 2nd Lieutenant Genjiro Imi from the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company scratched words into his journal that would reveal something terrifying: the absolute disbelief Japanese warriors experienced the moment they faced American forces in combat through towering palm canopies and choking jungle vines. Imi marched alongside 916 battle-hardened soldiers under Colonel Kiwano Ichiki's command. They had just disembarked from destroyers under cover of darkness, completing what Japanese leadership believed would be the opening move to seize Henderson Field. Intelligence briefings had assured them the Americans were barely 2,000 strong, inadequately trained, frightened easily, weakened by comfortable civilian lives. Colonel Ichiki himself had brushed aside recommendations to wait for additional troops. "We're fighting Americans," he declared to his command staff. "We'll drive them into the ocean before dawn breaks." These seasoned veterans of campaigns across China and Southeast Asia had no idea they were walking toward an encounter that would shatter everything the Imperial Japanese Army believed about warfare, not just military defeat, which seemed impossible for troops who'd known nothing except conquest since 1937, but a complete dismantling of every tactical principle, every strategic assumption, every ideological foundation that shaped Japanese military thinking. The jungle would become America's ally. The night, which Japanese forces had dominated since the war began, would turn against them. The staggering superiority in weaponry, tactical organization, and raw destructive power would obliterate the legend of Japanese dominance. In close quarters battle, the transformation had ignited 2 weeks prior on August 7th, when 11,000 United States Marines from the 1st Marine Division launched an amphibious assault at Lunga Point. General Alexander Vandergriff's Leathernecks were executing Operation Watchtower, marking America's first offensive strike in the Pacific theater. The mission appeared simple on maps: capture the Japanese airfield under construction, establish defensive positions, maintain control until relief arrived. Reality proved far more brutal. They were about to engage in the longest, most punishing campaign in Marine Corps' history against an environment that tested the absolute limits of human survival. Guadalcanal itself resembled a tropical nightmare. The island stretched 90 miles in length and 25 miles across, dominated by interior mountains climbing 8,000 feet into cloud cover that never cleared. The coastal plains surrounding Henderson Field consisted of kunai grass fields, fetid swamps, and jungle so impenetrable that visibility collapsed to arm's length. Heat pressed down like a physical weight, humidity locked perpetually above 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds thick enough to breathe in. Rivers and streams that appeared pristine in aerial reconnaissance photographs crawled with parasites and pathogens. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would eventually incapacitate more personnel than enemy weapons. That first morning, Marines discovered the airfield virtually abandoned. The 200 Japanese laborers and 600 naval troops had retreated into the interior, leaving behind equipment, provisions, and most critically, the airfield itself. By nightfall August 8th, American combat engineers were already completing runway construction. They christened it Henderson Field, honoring Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who fell at Midway. Within days, the first aircraft touched down, establishing what history would remember as the Cactus Air Force. Japan's response came swift and devastating to American naval assets. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commanded 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through pitch darkness in a masterful surprise engagement. The Battle of Savo Island became the United States Navy's worst single defeat. For heavy cruisers USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra went down in under 60 minutes. Over 1,000 sailors perished in burning waters. Surviving Allied naval vessels withdrew, taking most supplies that remained on transport ships. The Marines found themselves isolated, severed from support, confronting reinforced enemy forces with less than half their necessary equipment and provisions. What Japanese High Command failed to comprehend in those early August days was Henderson Field's strategic significance. Airfield control meant control over surrounding waters during daylight. Aircraft launching from Henderson could engage any Japanese vessel within 100 miles. This singular fact would dictate the campaign's entire character. Japanese forces could dominate nighttime operations, delivering troops and materiel aboard fast destroyers in runs nicknamed the Tokyo Express. But at sunrise, American aircraft owned the skies. Strategic reality demanded Japan recapture Henderson Field immediately before American fortifications became impregnable. Imperial General Headquarters tasked Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutaka's 17th Army at Rabor. Hyakutaki possessed limited available forces. The 35th Infantry Brigade, under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was stationed at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment remained in the Philippines. The nearest unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, positioned near Guam. Originally designated for the Midway operation cancelled after June's naval catastrophe, Colonel Kiyoano Ichiki was an infantry academy instructor renowned as an exceptional tactician. He was also known for impulsive decision-making and absolute faith. That Japanese fighting spirit trumped American material advantages. Before departing truck for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received explicit orders to await his regiment's remaining elements before attempting airfield recapture. But Ichiki held minimal respect for American combat capability. He'd studied after-action reports from China, the Philippines, every theater where Japanese forces encountered Western armies. They lacked discipline. They collapsed under pressure. They couldn't match Japanese warriors in hand-to-hand combat. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men from Ichiki's advance element to Taivu Point, 15 miles east of American defensive perimeters. The landing executed smoothly, undetected by American forces. Ichiki immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols to evaluate enemy strength and defensive arrangements. It was standard tactical procedure that would prove catastrophic. On August 19th, a patrol from A Company, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, commanded by Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal trail toward Coley Point when they encountered Japanese troops. Both forces clashed in a brief, savage firefight. Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and seized documents revealing a substantial enemy force operating in the sector. More significantly, captured intelligence showed Japanese command had drastically underestimated American troop strength. Captain Brush returned to the perimeter immediately with his intelligence haul. General Vandergrift grasped the implications. Instantly a Japanese assault was imminent, most likely from the eastern approach. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to reinforce defenses along the sandbar. At the mouth of what Marines designated the Tenaru River, it was actually the Ilu River, but the misidentification persisted in all subsequent historical accounts. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Cresswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the riverbank with machine guns positioned to generate overlapping fields of fire across the sandbar. What followed became one of the most lopsided engagements in Marine Corps' history. Colonel Ichiki, rather than awaiting intelligence from his missing patrol or reinforcements, chose to attack immediately, on the night of August 20th extending into early morning August 21st. He ordered a direct assault straight across the sandbar. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual superiority and aggressive nocturnal assaults. To neutralize enemy firepower, Ichiki believed his veterans could penetrate American defenses through sheer boldness and close-quarters fighting where Japanese soldiers excelled with bayonets and grenades. Just after midnight, Solomon Islands scout Jacob Vuza, who'd escaped Japanese captivity after hours of torture, staggered into Marine positions with a warning the Japanese were advancing. Minutes later, the attack commenced. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming war cries, firing rifles, throwing grenades. They ran directly into a killing zone Marines had prepared with methodical precision. The M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns opened fire. These weapons, perfected during the First World War, were the unsung champions of Marine firepower. Each gun could maintain 600 rounds per minute indefinitely provided the water jacket remained filled. Marines had positioned them in mutually supporting arrangements. As no section of the sandbar went uncovered, Japanese soldiers fell in successive waves as heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through flesh and bone. Those who reached across the sandbar encountered 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, essentially massive shotgun shells that shredded men into fragments. The attack continued for hours. Wave after wave of Japanese soldiers rushed into machine gun fire. Some reached Marine positions and engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought with rifles, knives, fists, whatever weapons came to hand. But defensive preparations held firm. The interlocking fire patterns prevented any Japanese breakthrough. As dawn approached, Colonel Ichiki's assault had completely stalled. More than 800 of his troops lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in shallow waters. Daybreak brought no respite for surviving Japanese forces. General Vandergrift ordered a counteroffensive using elements from 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar and began systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who'd taken cover in coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, observing from Marine positions, described the scene. It was fascinating watching them bustling among the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We hadn't realized so many Japanese were in the grove. Group after group were flushed out and cut down by the tank's canister shells. By midday August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru had concluded. Of 917 Japanese soldiers who'd landed at Taivu Point, approximately 800 were dead. Roughly 128 survivors, mostly from support elements that had remained near the landing zone, disappeared into jungle. They would transmit a radio message to 17th Army headquarters, reporting the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself, though accounts vary regarding his death. Official Japanese records claimed he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide. Some witnesses insisted he died leading a final charge. Marine casualties totaled approximately 40 killed and wounded. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese soldiers was devastating. Captured documents and post-war testimonies revealed the shock of learning an entire regiment had been annihilated in a single night. Americans hadn't fought according to Japanese doctrinal predictions. They didn't panic under night assault. They didn't break when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they'd waited in prepared positions, allowed Japanese forces to enter kill zones, and systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. The most devastating revelation came From examining captured equipment and assessing the battlefield, Americans possessed material wealth Japanese intelligence had completely failed to grasp. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond designed capacity, never failed from poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. Artillery support Marines could request exceeded anything Japanese forces could deploy, and coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from offshore ships represented an integrated system of destruction Japanese forces had never encountered. Within days of the Tenaru catastrophe, additional Japanese forces were already en route to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto organized a massive naval operation, supporting the next attempt to retake Henderson Field. 3 slow transport vessels departed truck on August 16th, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment plus 500 naval infantry. After the naval battle of the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one transport, Japanese command decided to abandon slow transport ships entirely. Instead, they would utilize destroyers for what became the Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers delivered nearly 5,000 troops from Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point. The Tokyo Express functioned brilliantly as a troop transport method. Destroyers could complete the round trip from Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, minimizing exposure to American air attack. But the method had a critical weakness: heavy equipment couldn't be transported this way. Artillery, pieces, tanks, trucks, and most importantly, adequate food and ammunition had to be left behind. This logistical reality would ultimately doom every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived with only what they could carry. They depended on local foraging and whatever supplies could be infiltrated through American lines. As the campaign progressed, Japanese troops found themselves fighting not just against American firepower, but against starvation itself. General Kawaguchi designated September 12th as the assault date on Henderson Field. His plan involved a 3-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along coastal areas. A second force would attack from the south, penetrating through dense jungle to strike what Japanese intelligence believed was the weakest point in American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would command the main effort from the south, approaching along an inland ridge dominating Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi didn't know was Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most probable approach route. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding the 1st Raider Battalion, conducted a raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th and discovered massive supply dumps, indicating a large Japanese force was concentrating in the area. Edson immediately understood the Japanese plan. They would advance from the south, using the ridge as their approach route. Edson requested authorization to establish a defensive line on the ridge itself. General Vandegrift approved. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same methodical care that had characterized Tenaru defenses. Machine guns positioned to create interlocking fire. Mortar crews registered on probable approach routes. Artillery from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions. Every terrain and firepower advantage was calculated and prepared. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine, approximately 1,000 meters long, consisting of 3 distinct hills covered with kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines bordered both sides, heavily forested and in places impenetrable. It was perfect terrain for a night attack by infiltrating infantry. It was also, if properly defended, a killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces launched their assault. Unlike Ichiki's frontal charge, this was more sophisticated. Japanese infantry infiltrated through ravines on both ridge sides, attempting to envelop American positions. Small units probed for weak points. When discovered, larger forces concentrated. For breakthrough attempts, the fighting was brutal and chaotic. In darkness, Marines sometimes found themselves in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who'd infiltrated to grenade range. But defensive preparations held. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts, Marine mortars and artillery shattered them. The 11th Marines fired over 2,000 rounds during the night, dropping high explosive shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until barrels glowed red in darkness. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything available. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same scout who'd warned of the Tenaru attack, moved through positions, encouraging Marines and identifying Japanese infiltration routes. Sergeant John Bosselone manned a machine gun position. That became critical to the defense. When his gun crews were killed or wounded, Bosselone continued firing alone, propelling wave after wave of Japanese attacks. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor at Edson's Ridge, and 19 would receive the Navy Cross. As dawn broke September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to break through. But Kawaguchi had additional troops available and prepared to renew the assault the following night. Edson pulled his lines back to the ridge center. Consolidating forces, General Vandegrift sent reinforcements, bringing total defending forces to approximately 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again, but this time Marines were ready with even stronger positions and more concentrated firepower. The second night's fighting proved even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi threw his remaining forces into desperate breakthrough attempts. Before American reinforcements made the position impregnable, Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly, dying by the hundreds in machine gun fire. Some attacks came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped. At one point, the situation was so desperate that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line. But again, American firepower and defensive preparation prevailed. By dawn September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. Japanese casualties were staggering. Approximately 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers died on and around Edson's Ridge. Marine casualties totaled approximately 100 for killed and over 200 wounded. Between Raider and Parachute battalions, the ridge that would forever be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge had become a monument to American defensive doctrine's effectiveness for Japanese soldiers who survived. The battle represented another profound shock to their understanding of warfare. Capture diaries and post-war accounts consistently described the same realization. Japanese forces had expected to fight other infantry in darkness, where their training and spirit would triumph. Instead, they encountered artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all concentrated with precision they couldn't match. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They prepared kill zones. They waited for Japanese forces to enter, then they destroyed them with coordinated fire support. The battles at Tenaru and Bloody Ridge established patterns that would repeat throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese forces would launch attacks based on courage, night tactics, and close combat expertise. American forces would respond with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined arms operations, and defensive positions carefully prepared to maximize their advantages. The outcome was predictable. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic. American casualties significant, but sustainable. But numbers alone don't capture jungle warfare's horror on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became a weapon, killing with impartiality. Malaria infected nearly every man, spending more than a few weeks on the island. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division would report over 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical diseases disabled approximately 2/3 of the division. Dysentery was universal. Men suffered from fungal infections eating through skin. Jungle rot caused open sores never healing in humid heat. Dental problems with no treatment led to abscessed teeth and systemic infections. The Japanese suffered even worse. Their supply situation meant inadequate food from the beginning. Soldiers were supposed to receive field rations, but the Tokyo Express could rarely deliver enough. Men subsisted on whatever they could forage, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries stretched impossibly thin. Starvation became constant companion. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine for malaria prevention ran out quickly and was never adequately resupplied. Wounded soldiers often died from infections easily treatable with proper medicine. Japanese documents captured later in the campaign painted a horrifying picture of conditions. A medical officer's report from late October noted more than 60% of 17th Army forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition. Combat effectiveness had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, most from starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. American supply ships protected by Henderson Field aircraft during daylight regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Shortages occurred, particularly in August and early September, when naval defeats left Marines temporarily cut off. But these were temporary. By October, supply flow had become reliable. Marines ate canned rations that, while not appetizing, provided adequate calories and nutrition. Ammunition was plentiful enough that machine gunners could fire until barrels wore out, then request replacements. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical capabilities, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfur drugs for infection, and eventual evacuation of serious cases to rear area hospitals. Japanese logistics consisted of whatever could be carried on destroyer decks or infiltrated through American lines. Soldiers learned to make a single rice bowl last an entire day. Ammunition was conserved to the point. Orders often restricted fire to only when absolutely necessary. Medical care meant a bandage if lucky, amputation without anesthesia if unlucky, or death if wounds became infected. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given grenades and left behind to commit suicide rather than burden their units or risk capture. In late October, the Japanese mounted their largest offensive of the campaign. General Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal to personally command operations. He brought elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops from China. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main effort coming from the south through dense jungle, similar to the Bloody Ridge approach. This time, however, Japanese forces would have more men, better coordination, and artillery support finally delivered via destroyers. The offensive began October 23rd with a preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, rare on Guadalcanal because of transport difficulty, led an assault across the Tenaru River. American defenders, including elements from the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the Imperial Division, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties. The main assault came on the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Imi attacked from the south, hoping to break through American lines south of Henderson Field. They faced 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements from the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that night became legendary in Marine Corps history. Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the night. Individual breakthroughs were sealed by immediate counterattacks. Machine gunners fired until weapons failed, then grabbed rifles and continued fighting. Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger close missions, landing within yards of Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood by, ready to provide naval gunfire support if called upon. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between Japanese forces and Henderson Field, but they didn't break. Sergeant John Bosellone, who distinguished himself at Bloody Ridge, again became critical to the defense. When ammunition ran low for his machine gun section, Bosellone personally carried ammunition through enemy fire to keep guns operational. He repaired damaged machine guns under fire. When one gun position was overrun, he grabbed a .45 pistol and led a counterattack, restoring the line. By dawn October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attempt to break through. American casualties were several hundred killed and wounded, severe but sustainable. October 1942 also saw major naval engagements, decisively shifting the balance of power around Guadalcanal. The naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th through 15th, saw some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. In a confused nighttime engagement on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force including battleships Haie and Kirishima. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in World War II surface engagements, died in the fighting. Americans lost 2 light cruisers, and for destroyers, 3 more destroyers were damaged, but the Japanese lost battleship Haie, disabled in night action and sunk by aircraft the following day. More importantly, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. On the night of November 14th to 15th, battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment, but was intercepted by USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a devastating display of American radar-directed gunnery, Washington put 9 16-inch shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target. Kirishima sank with heavy loss of life. Perhaps most significantly, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and these were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties from the convoy exceeded 5,000 men. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force for Japanese troops already on the island. November marked the beginning of the end. They'd expected reinforcement and resupply. Instead, they learned naval battles had failed. Convoys were destroyed. No more help was coming. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies that had been critically short became non-existent. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors could do nothing except watch men die. Captured Japanese diaries from this period painted a picture of slow collapse. Entries described rice rations reduced to 1 bowl per day, disease spreading everywhere, bodies burned when soldiers had strength, realization no more supplies were coming, men eating grass and bark, deaths from poisonous plants, deterioration of soldiers into desperate starving shadows. December brought final reckoning. Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. They couldn't admit defeat publicly, but privately recognized continuing the operation meant complete destruction of the 17th Army. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained on the island, down from peak strength of 36,000. Of those, 11,000, perhaps 7,000 were fit enough to walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weakened by starvation they could barely crawl. The evacuation, designated Operation K, would be one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. Using destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express, Japanese naval forces extracted 10,652 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a remarkable achievement under difficult circumstances, but couldn't disguise the magnitude of defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reached peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of these, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died, about 14,800 killed in combat, and 10,000 to 15,000 from disease and starvation. American casualties were also severe, but sustainable. Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,000 to 100 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But American industry and manpower could replace these losses. New divisions were already training. Ships and aircraft were being produced faster than they could be lost. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thought cannot be overstated. For the first time, Japanese forces had been defeated in sustained ground combat. Every offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had resulted in catastrophic casualties. The revelation that American forces were not only materially superior, but also tactically competent, well-led, and capable of enduring terrible conditions shattered pre-war assumptions. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed after the war consistently emphasized several themes. First, they'd completely underestimated American fighting qualities. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies was far greater than intelligence had suggested. Third, Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for sustained operations against an enemy controlling sea and air. Fourth, spiritual power and tactical skill were insufficient against systematic disadvantage in firepower and resources. Post-war accounts from Japanese veterans revealed consistent assessment. They'd believed they were superior warriors. They trained harder, accepted death more readily, mastered night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned war is decided by systems. Americans had systems for everything: supply, medical care, artillery support, air coordination. Every system functioned. Japanese systems failed because they were never built properly in the first place. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign and were later interviewed provided detailed accounts, contradicting official Japanese explanations for defeat. They acknowledged American forces fought superbly at night when defending prepared positions. They admitted Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and terrible conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness because logistics supported them. They recognized American firepower was overwhelming, coordinated, and precisely delivered. A single American battalion had more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. Technical aspects of American superiority were significant. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fought with Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons requiring manual cycling between shots. American Marines initially carried M1903 Springfield rifles, also bolt-action, but supplemented by the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle. As these became available, the Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic operation provided advantages in firefights. Machine guns told an even starker story. The American M1917A1 Browning was water-cooled and could sustain fire indefinitely as long as water and ammunition were available. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and more portable, but lacked sustained fire capability. In defensive positions, this difference was decisive. Artillery superiority was perhaps most significant. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers that could be broken down and transported through jungle terrain. These 75mm weapons provided responsive, accurate fire support. Forward observers with infantry units could call for fire missions and receive rounds within minutes. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited, difficult to move through jungle, and chronically short of ammunition. Naval gunfire added another dimension Japanese forces couldn't match. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could deliver bombardments on Japanese positions, or provide responsive fire support for Marine ground units. Radio communication between shore-based observers and naval ships allowed precise targeting. Air power became increasingly dominant as the campaign progressed. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under terrible conditions, gradually established air superiority over Guadalcanal. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobra, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bomber raids. SPD Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese positions, supply ships, and troop concentrations. Japanese air forces from Rabaul had to fly at extreme limits of their range, giving them minimal time over target. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now including both Marine and Army divisions, launched coordinated attacks, systematically reducing remaining Japanese positions. The offensive had overwhelming support from artillery, air power, and naval gunfire. Japanese resistance, while determined, was hampered by starvation, disease, and ammunition shortages. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered Japanese forces had evacuated. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. 6 months of fighting had resulted in the first major American ground victory against Japan. More importantly, it established patterns and revealed truths shaping the rest of the Pacific War. The lessons Japanese survivors took from Guadalcanal were devastating to pre-war military doctrine. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been shattered. Individual courage and tactical skill were inadequate against systematic disadvantage. Night attacks and close combat, the hallmarks of Japanese tactical success in China, failed against American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary concerns, but fundamental requirements for sustained combat. Air and naval superiority determined outcomes on land. These lessons learned in blood and starvation on Guadalcanal should have fundamentally reformed Japanese military thinking. Some officers recognized the implications. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, wrote afterward that Japan needed to completely reassess its strategy. The Americans, he observed, were fighting an industrial war where material production determined outcomes. Japan couldn't win an industrial war against American productive capacity. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and recent victories, couldn't easily accept such fundamental revision. The official explanation for Guadalcanal blamed inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and unexpected strength of American defenses. It didn't acknowledge Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed, that the entire conception of warfare that had served Japan well against China was obsolete against a modern industrial opponent. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and were later captured, or who survived the war, became witnesses to a transformation they never expected. They entered the campaign as confident warriors of an invincible empire. They left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of catastrophic defeat. Many later described Guadalcanal as the moment they first understood Japan would lose the war. Post-war testimonies from Japanese veterans captured this psychological transformation. They acknowledged learning truths leaders had hidden. Americans were not weak, but overwhelmingly strong, not just in weapons, but in organization, logistics, leadership, and the ability to sustain combat operations. Japanese forces fought with courage and skill. It didn't matter. American forces fought with systems and resources Japanese forces couldn't match. The American perspective on Guadalcanal emphasized different lessons. For Marines and soldiers who fought there, the campaign proved American forces could match Japanese troops in the brutality of jungle combat. The mythology of Japanese invincibility was destroyed. American defensive doctrine worked. Combined arms coordination was effective. Individual American soldiers, properly trained and equipped, were more than capable of defeating Japanese forces. But Americans also learned respect for Japanese soldiers as tough, determined, skilled adversaries who would fight to the death rather than surrender. The willingness of Japanese forces to continue attacking in the face of hopeless odds, to endure starvation rather than give up, to die rather than retreat, made a profound impression. The contrast between both sides' approaches to prisoner welfare and surrender illustrated fundamental cultural differences. American forces made efforts to encourage Japanese surrender, dropping leaflets, broadcasting radio messages, offering medical care and food to prisoners. These efforts had minimal success. Of approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most were too sick or wounded to resist. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual evacuation demonstrated the Japanese defensive perimeter could be penetrated. Allied strategy shifted from defensive operations to offensive campaigns. The industrial and material advantages America possessed could be translated into military victory if applied systematically. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. Loss of experienced troops, pilots, and ships couldn't be replaced at anything approaching the rate America was producing new forces. The decision to evacuate admitted, however quietly, that Japan couldn't sustain attritional warfare against American industrial might. Veterans of Guadalcanal on both sides carried their experiences. For the rest of their lives, American Marines and soldiers who survived the campaign became cadres for new units, passing along hard-won lessons about jungle warfare, defensive tactics, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1940 to required months of rest and rehabilitation before returning to combat. Japanese survivors faced an even grimmer future. Those evacuated during Operation were dispersed to other units throughout the Pacific, carrying with them the psychological burden of defeat and knowledge that American forces were far more formidable than pre-war propaganda had suggested. Many would die in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic position continued deteriorating. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the scars of 6 months' intense combat for decades afterward. Wrecked aircraft, destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered jungles and coastal areas. Henderson Field, expanded and improved during and after the campaign, served as a major Allied base for subsequent operations. In the Solomons, for military historians and strategists, Guadalcanal provided case studies in amphibious operations, jungle warfare, logistics, air-ground coordination, and integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign demonstrated modern warfare required more than brave soldiers and tactical skill. It required industrial capacity, effective logistics, technological superiority, and the ability to sustain operations over extended periods. The human cost of Guadalcanal was staggering on both sides. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen died in naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 from all causes. Thousands more on both sides suffered from diseases and conditions affecting their health for the rest of their lives. But strategic significance justified, in military terms, the terrible cost. Guadalcanal represented the turning point where Allied forces shifted from defense to offense in the Pacific. It demonstrated Japan could be defeated in ground combat. It established air and naval superiority patterns characterizing the rest of the war. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is ultimately a story about collision between two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. One side believed in supremacy of warrior spirit, encourage overcoming material disadvantage, in tactics producing victory regardless of resources. The other side believed in systematic application of industrial power, in logistics and firepower, as force multipliers, in combined arms coordination as the key to success. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting philosophies met. The outcome, though it took 6 months of brutal fighting to reach its inevitable conclusion, demonstrated that concentrated fire support and logistics, when combined with competent tactics and determined soldiers, created a form of military power Japanese forces simply couldn't match. For Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived to tell their stories, the campaign represented the moment reality destroyed illusion. They learned their training had been based on false assumptions, their tactics designed for a different kind of war, their logistics inadequate from the beginning, and their nation was engaged in a conflict it couldn't win through military means alone. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned different, but equally important lessons. They discovered they could match Japanese soldiers in combat's brutality. They proved American industrial power could be translated into military victory. They developed tactics and doctrine for jungle warfare, serving them well in subsequent campaigns. And they shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with realistic assessment of a tough, determined, but ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops were terrified not by American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved formidable, but by the systematic, overwhelming, relentless application of firepower, and material resources American forces brought to every engagement. It was terror born not from fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained to accept, but from realization that courage and sacrifice were meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never stopped firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japanese forces would be on the defensive, fighting a losing battle against an enemy whose material advantages grew larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the template for future campaigns, proving American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain against a determined enemy, provided they had adequate logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower.